Hi everyone, my name is Alex and welcome back to my channel, or if this is your first time here, welcome. And we're just gonna let my creativity fly with this or else it will never leave my brain. So today we are doing something a little bit different and we are going to be talking about the life of a famous celebrity. So usually I do videos on haunted places and the history. In general, I love to do research. If you give me a topic, I will completely do a deep dive. I love it. I love learning every little piece of information and I love history. I don't know why I'm like this. I don't know. But I will explain why I'm doing Annie Oakley, and there's a reason behind this. So let's dive right in. This hat is seriously too small for my head. So Annie Oakley's real name is Phoebe Ann Mosey, but her nickname was Annie because of her middle name. She was born on August 13th, 1860 in Darke County, Ohio. She was born in a log cabin around 2 miles northwest of Willowdale. So if you don't know the area of like Willowdale in Darke County, this area is all country farmland. It was then and it still is now. Her parents, who were Quakers, were from Hollidaysburg, Blair County, Pennsylvania, and they were Susan Wise and Jacob Mosey. They rented a farm in Patterson Township, Darke County, Ohio, and they eventually purchased it around 1855. And this is a quote from thegartsmuseum.org/historic people, and I just really love this quote about the area. Quote, "To gain a perspective, imagine what Ohio was like in 1860. Visualize a forested land with small cleared areas for farming, towns, and villages. There were only a few good dirt roads, still is." There were only a good few dirt roads, and travel for most people was by horseback, wagon, or by foot. Okay, so the whole reason why I wanted to do research on her, this wasn't totally random. So like my whole entire life growing up, anytime we would drive south towards Greenville or traveling or something like that, we would always pass this sign that said Annie Oakley's grave in a little pointer. And we've never visited it. And there's a giant barn that has a painting of Annie Oakley like shooting a gun. Never had any clue like why she was buried there, what her history was, or anything like that. We never talked about her in school, even though she's a famous local celebrity who was born really close to us, and she was buried there, and we had no clue about her. So over Thanksgiving break, I was actually driving back home to Indiana, where I currently live, and I passed by the sign, and I'm like, you know what? It's bothered me for 29 years. I'm going to go visit her grave. And we've talked about it, like just randomly, some people go visit, just say hi, but I'm like, I just have to see it. So I turned around. It's like a 5-minute drive back to where she is. It's a little tiny grave, and I went on probably the creepiest day. The sun was setting because the sun sets a lot earlier. It was cold. It was just eerie out there. Super easy to find her. There's a giant like Ohio historic sign, what they do, and it had like her history like front and back, and I'm like, okay, so there she is. There's the Annie Oakley buried here. And I'm like, okay, I have to do research. I have to find out more about her because this is so random. I guess we're gonna do a total biography on her. So Annie was the 6th of 9 total children, and she was the 5th of the 7 surviving. So there's a lot about her siblings that I did a lot of research on. So her siblings were Mary Jane, there's Lydia, Elizabeth, Sarah Ellen, Catherine, John, Hulda, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and then there's a stillborn infant brother who passed away, and I don't think he was ever given a name. I'm going to talk about them and what's happened with them after a little bit more about Annie's history, because I don't want to like spoil anything. There's a lot, and this information was not easy to come by. So their last names were somewhat of a topic. There are many different variations. Many references refer to them as Moses, but in the 1860s consensus, it shows as Mauzy, M-A-U-Z-Y. But that could have just been an error by the census recorder. That happens because they weren't really accurate at the time. But in the 1870 census, it appears as Mosey, M-O-S-E-Y. And Mosey is what it is on the father's headstone and military records. The official Annie Oakley Foundation uses Mosey, the M-O-S-E-Y, and it's still being used by current living relatives. Mosie, M-O-S-I-E, sometimes appears. The 1800s were just okay. John and Huldah actually changed their surname to Moses. Annie spelled it Mosey, like M-O-Z-E-E, because of the spelling. Maybe they pronounced it the same way, like Mosey. I don't know. They were super wonderful at keeping accurate records at the time. They were growing up in this log cabin, all a million of their children. So we're going to first talk about her father. Her father was caught in a huge snowstorm while he was riding on his wagon home with supplies. Now, at the time, riding on a wagon, riding 14 miles, I believe that's around what it was, there and back on a wagon with a horse takes about a full day. So, like, that's not an easy errand to make at all. So he was caught in a huge snowstorm, and he was barely alive when he finally made it home, and he contracted pneumonia. He ended up dying on February 11th, 1866. Annie's great-grandniece, Bess Edwards, whose grandfather was John, Annie's brother, tells the story of what John told her growing up about the event. Apparently, Jacob wasn't dressed very well for the weather, just normal fall clothing. When he got home, he was soaking wet. His hands were frozen to the reins of the horse. They laid him down in front of the fireplace to try to warm him up. They wrapped him up and laid him down in bed. That was in November, and he ended up passing away in February. After this, they were forced to move to a smaller town. All of the children from 2 years old to 15 years old worked very hard to provide food. Susan would still gather them all to sing hymns and pray. She really did try her best. This is a quote from the garstmuseum.org. The destitute family moved into a rented farm, but life did not improve. Annie's oldest sister, Mary Jane, came down with tuberculosis and ended up dying. And Susan Moses sold Pink, the family cow, to pay for doctor bills and funeral bills. So Mary Jane was the next to pass away in the family just a year after their father passed away. The mom's youngest child, Huldah, was the first to be taken away from the family. The Bartholomew family was very willing to help out, and they took in Huldah for a short time. Susan was a caregiver and helped families who needed a nurse. She would do housework and cooked for families. She would get around $1.25 each week, but there were just so many children and they needed the help. $1.25. Annie's mother married Daniel Brunbraw I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, in August of 1867. Their family was not very wealthy at all, and they had been struggling for years. On March 15, 1870, they decided to send Annie and her sister, Sarah Ellen, to a nearby state orphanage, the Darke County Infirmary, which was run by a family friend, Samuel Crawford Eddington, along with his wife, Nancy. Nancy taught them how to sew and to decorate. By the spring of 1870, Samuel then contracted Annie out to a nearby family to help care for their new baby on the promise of 50 cents per week and an education. And here we're going to be talking about some not so great things, so just a trigger warning. The family originally wanted someone who was bigger to be able to help pump water, to cook, but probably not 9-year-old Annie. Instead, she became a slave to the family. They kept her at home to make her work in the house and on the farm. They abused her, and no schooling was ever offered. Annie would refer to them as the wolves. She never named who they were, but there are some pretty good educated guesses. Just so I don't get sued, I am not going to list those names, but you can research who they might be. I think there are like 2 educated guesses on the family and of the time and everything. I really don't feel like getting sued, so we're not going to mention anything. The wife one time put Annie outside in the freezing cold without her shoes as punishment because she fell asleep while mending clothes. There is suspicion that the father would SA her. Annie Oakley's 1925 biography, she talks about this experience. She's talking about the man coming into the infirmary wanting a small girl as company for his wife. To quote, "The girl would have no work," he said, "except to watch a 3-week-old baby boy. He looked at all the little girls and then asked Auntie Mrs. Eddington about Annie, about me. I told Auntie I wanted to go, so I sent a letter asking my mother. The man was to come for me in 2 weeks and see if my mother consented. She did, and I went away from him. All went well for a month, then work began to stack up. I got up at 4 a.m. I got breakfast, milked the cows, fed the calves, the pigs, pumped the water for the cattle, fed the chickens, rocked the baby to sleep, weeded the garden, picked wild berries, got dinner after digging the potatoes for dinner, picking the vegetables, and then go hunting and trapping. Mother wanted me to come home, and they wouldn't let me. I think there's a typo, but I'm going to read it as a typo. I'm not 100% sure. They wrote all the letter to my mother telling her that I was happy and I was going to school. One night, I nodded over a big basket of stockings that I had darned, which is patch up. Suddenly, the she-wolf struck me across the ears, pinched my arms, and threw me out the doors into the deep snow and locked the door. I had no shoes on, and in a few minutes, my feet grew numb. I was slowly freezing to death, so I got down on my knees and I looked towards God's clear sky and I tried to pray, but my lips were frozen stiff and there was no sound. End quotes. In 1872, she ran away from the wolves. She walked to the train depot, but she didn't have the money to buy a ticket. A kind man, however, listened to her story about what happened and ended up buying her food and a ticket. And he wrote, quote, "For years I prayed to God each night to keep the good man who helped me away from the wolves." End quote. Susan, her mother, was actually away at this time, so Annie went to the Shaws, which were family friends, and they took her in and cared for her while her mother worked. The he-wolf showed up to Annie's school once, but luckily Frank Eddington, who was a 6'2" big guy, helped, and the he-wolf never came back. So around the time that she was 15, her stepfather died from a fall, leaving her mother to be a widow once again with a brand new baby named Emmeline? I feel like Emmeline. Annie's mother married again in 1874 to the mailman and old friend Joseph Shaw. Annie began trapping at 5 years old. She would trap birds and small animals. Quote, by age 7, she began using the old muzzle-loading gun that belonged to her father, end quote, according to the official Annie Oakley Center Foundation. She did this to help support her siblings and her mother. She would sell what she hunted to the locals in Greenville. One couple she sold to were the shopkeepers, Charles and G. Anthony Katzenberger, who then would ship it to the hotels in Cincinnati and other cities. She also sold to nearby restaurants and hotels in North Ohio. She was so good, she paid off her mother's mortgage by the time she was 15 years old. She's an amazing shot. She's naturally right-handed, but she learned how to use her left hand equally. This is kind of gross, but she would headshot ducks so perfectly that there would be no unusable or embedded meat. But she's really that good. She worked hard in her education. She practiced reading and writing and female arts like needlework. Most of the earnings that she made was to help pay off the mortgage for the farm, while her family's new husband, Joseph, was going blind. This woman cannot find a good, healthy man. Everyone just has problems. It's also the 1800s. So I believe during this time, she was still living in the orphanage for a few years after she escaped from the wolves. But then she helped pay off the house, and then she moved back in with her family. And all during this, Annie is starting to become very well known in the area. I'm going to take a quick break from Annie's history, and I want to talk about her siblings because a lot of them passed away at such a young age, and they're not really talked about a lot. And I had to do a lot of research just to figure out how and when and why a lot of her siblings died at a young age. We won't really talk about her siblings much more after this, so I just wanted to quickly just let you know what happened, because it was just kind of odd to me. I know this was the 1800s. A lot of people didn't live that long. So there was Mary Jane, who we did talk about, who died at the age of 16 in 1867. She died of tuberculosis a year after their father died. Then there was Lydia, who died at the age of 29. She did marry and she did have one child, but she passed away at 29, and that is all that I wrote. That's all that I could find. Then there was Elizabeth. She never married, and she died at the age of 26. Some of these, I don't know if you do know, or if you're like a family member, you can fill in little blanks. I'm just curious because it's a lot of early deaths. Sarah Ellen did pass away at the age of 82. Sarah Ellen did marry, but she didn't have any children. I have two contradicting notes. So she either died at the age of 73 or 82, and she died from a car accident, unfortunately. But she did live to be a lot older than a lot of her siblings. Catherine was an infant when she died. She died a couple months after she was born. I'm not sure from what. John died at the age of 88. So John married. He had many, many children, and his descendants are still alive, and he passed away at the age of 88. Huldah was married 3 times, had 2 children, and she ended up dying at the age of 70. There was the stillborn infant brother. I could not find a name. I don't think they gave a name to the infant. And then there was Emmeline Brumbrough, who was the half-sister of Annie Oakley, and she was the only child from Susan's second marriage. So she did marry, but she didn't have any children. But she did die at the age of 69, so she had a long life as well. So back to Annie Oakley's history. In 1875, on Thanksgiving, the Brahman and Butler Shooting Act was performing in Cincinnati. The traveling show marksman and the former dog trainer Frank E. Butler, who was an Irish immigrant, placed a $100 bet, which was around $2,700 today. Big bet. He placed the bet with the hotel owner Jack Frost that he could be any local fancy shooter. I'm not really sure why he did this, just to drum up, I don't know, win some money. Butler himself was known as a theatrical gunman. It's kind of like for show, doing these kind of fun little gun shooting tricks. And so Annie was actually in the city visiting her married sister Lydia. Jack Frost knew of Annie and arranged the match. She was only 15 years old, standing at 5 feet tall. She's a little lady. Also, she's 15 years old. And Butler at the time was 28 years old. Butler ended up missing the 25th shot, losing the bet to Annie. One record stated that he shot the bird, but it fell 2 feet outside of the boundary line. But Annie did not miss any of her 25 shots. Frank would later say, according to the Annie Oakley Center Foundation, quote, that he lost as soon as he saw the pretty lady and shy 15-year-old girl step up to the mark. What is certain is that he had fallen for her, end quote. Remember the age difference. Frank brought his French poodle named George, and Annie loved that dog. Butler accepted his defeat and started to court Annie. A different time, but gross. They would write letters to each other, and Frank would sign his letters from George, the dog. So something weird happens around their marriage, and I think it's about show business, and I will explain this. So Annie and Frank got married in 1876 when Annie was 16 and Frank was 29. But it is believed that they were married in Cincinnati. But there is some speculation around the year because there's a marriage certificate for 1882 in Ontario. So one thing about Frank was that he was actually married before, and some people speculated maybe that their divorce wasn't completely finalized by 1876, or maybe their certificate in 1882 was for show business. Because for some reason they wanted to make Annie 6 years younger than she actually was as she aged, which that's like worst. But it was great for show business because people want to come see the great, amazing young child who's a girl and is a sharpshooter. Like, she never misses her shots. Like, that's amazing. People want to come see that, and somehow she just never ages. She's just always this young child. She was a child. But that's, I think maybe that's a reason for why they got another certificate. I'm not really sure, but there's some speculation there. Annie did later confirm later on in her life that they did wed on August 23rd, 1876. And they were married for 50 happy years. Frank did have 2 children, Edward and Katie, from his previous marriage, who Annie adopted, and they never had any children of their own. There was something weird when I was researching about Frank's first wife. about her name. So I kept seeing the name Henrietta Saunders pop up across many websites, including Wikipedia, but on the official Annie Oakley Center Foundation, it says Elizabeth, which that's kind of weird. Something weird was Frank's actual age. This one is really weird. So again, records were really bad back then. His passport says he was born in 1852, but there's a record of his baptism in 1847. What? But then on his obituary, it says that he was born in 1850. So let's talk about Annie Oakley's name. So Annie was a nickname based on her middle name. But where does Oakley come from? No one really knows for sure. But she wanted to keep her private life separated from her famous life. So that's why she came up with the stage name, Annie Oakley. There is a guess that maybe she took the name from the man who helped her get a train ticket when she was a kid, but she did mention a few times that she regretted never learning his name. Or maybe she took the name from a place in Cincinnati, but no one knows for sure. So Frank was a gentle and a happy man. He made friends very easily. He didn't smoke or drink or gamble. The poverty that he was born into taught him to be hardworking and frugal. He had a romantic flair and a sense of showmanship. He was literally born to be a star. He would write poems to Annie and taught her how to express her personality on stage. According to the Annie Oakley Center Foundation, he was never jealous of Annie. He never seemed to be embarrassed to be known as Mr. Annie Oakley. Their marriage was a partnership, truly. With Frank, Phoebe adopted the stage name Annie Oakley, and they started traveling the country at variety shows and circuses. She would make her own costumes. She would have ankle-length dresses with buckskin fringes and often would wear a cowboy hat. She would perform lively shooting acts, skipping around the arena, bringing down fast-moving targets. She's apparently actually never been more west than Kansas, but her appearance and her mannerisms became very popular in the West, and she became known as the Woman of the West. Her big break came when she was accepted into the Buffalo Bill Wild West Exposition, which was ran by William Cody, aka Buffalo Bill, the Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill actually rejected her first application, but when his partner Nate Salisbury saw her performing and shooting, he was very impressed. In her act, she would perfectly shoot clay pigeons in rapid succession, shooting clusters of glass balls thrown into the air, riding a horse side saddle while untying a ribbon from one of its legs. Like, literally, what can't this woman do? So most women in the 1800s who did actually work and have a paying job, which was not very common, they would work in burlesque, vaudeville, which is like theater, burlesque kind of plays, or like theater or show circuit at the time, but they all kind of had reputations of slanderly behavior. Annie did everything in her power to not have that type of reputation. She did not want that sort of image for herself. Glenda Riley wrote, quote, "She believed that a quintessential Victorian woman must embody 5 major qualities. A genuine lady should be modest, married, domestic, benevolent, and a civilizing force," end quote. So her dresses were modestly buttoned up to her neck, and she would always ride her horse's side saddle even while shooting, never drank or gambled, and she lived in values up to the Quaker principles. Since she was often on the road, she couldn't really have that Victorian home that she wanted, but she would decorate her boarding house rooms, her circus tents with elaborate draperies and knickknacks. She would invite women to tea like normal society women would do. She would position herself in the doorway of her tent between acts and embroider to indicate that she was living up to the idealistic domestic lifestyle. This is something that she wanted to do. She really did not want a tainted reputation at all. Even though she was already unconventional, doing mostly a man's job with her act, she still did not see herself as a feminist and didn't even advocate for women's right to vote. But she wanted to blend her life as the daring stage act and a normal feminine woman of the house as much as she possibly could. So the Wild West show became insanely popular during her first season, which was in the summer and the fall of 1885, and it ran until the next summer at Staten Island in New York with around 360,000 visitors. That's so many. Buffalo Bill was one of the first showmen to romanticize the western frontier. He helped create the storybook image of cowboys and Native Americans, settlers, prospectors, and soldiers, and it's been an American staple ever since. He would educate, collect testimonials from generals and presidents who have said that his shows exhibited a taste of what the West was like to help people who have never been out there, including Annie Oakley, who's never been out in the West. Just a little bit of research on Buffalo Bill because, again, I didn't really know anything about him. So Buffalo Bill is originally from North Platte, Nebraska, and he previously worked as a hunter providing the Transcontinental Railroad crews with buffalo meat, aka the nickname origin. As a white man, just to note that, he was super excited to see the expansion of the Euro-American civilization further into the United States, but he knew the tragic point of view from the Native Americans. He understood what they had to go through. That's a very short history about him, but I just wanted to point that out. Their act became very famous by 1887, and they were even invited to England to perform for Queen Victoria's 50th year on the throne. This girl was born and raised 30 miles south of my hometown, and we never learned anything about her. She performed for Queen Victoria of England. So they went over, and the Queen was actually in attendance, as well as her son, Prince Edward, the daughter-in-law, Alexandra of Denmark, and the ex-Prime Minister, William Gladstone. I don't know much history about them, but those were the people that were in attendance. However, when Annie and Buffalo Bill went to England is when the two started to fall out. Buffalo Bill decided to add another girl to their group. Her name was Lillian Frances Smith, and Annie was not happy about this decision. Lillian was ill-mannered and boastful, but she also was very talented, but she was a young teenager. Journalists loved both women, but would write more about Annie because of their ideal standards of women at the time. Annie fit their standards more than Lily. By the end of the British shows, Annie and Frank left the show and decided to tour around Europe for the rest of the summer. They ended up working for another Wild West show the following summer, and she won a challenge from her new boss, Pawnee Bill. She killed 49 out of 50 live pigeons in front of 12,000 people. A 12,000 person crowd. That's so many, but she did 49 out of 50. The next year, Annie did rejoin Buffalo Bill's show once again after Lillian Smith did leave because Lillian ran away with one of the show's cowboys, and that was a bit scandalous. But she left the show, and Annie's like, bye. Annie was again the star of the show during their Paris exhibition. The Eiffel Tower had just been built. And she was there. The Eiffel Tower had just been built, and it was the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Her performance was becoming even more elaborate. She would shoot the ash off a cigarette in her husband's mouth. She would shoot a dime in between his finger and thumb. A dime. And she would shoot an apple off of her pet dog's head. Annie and Buffalo Bill were also in a theatrical scene together, which showed the settler spirit and Western soldiers, their bravery in rescuing the helpless women and children from bandits or Native Americans. So the King of Senegal, which is a French colony in Africa, offered Buffalo Bill 100,000 francs to buy Annie Oakley. So I did the math of what this would be today. So 100 francs would be around $3.34 USD. So 100,000 francs would be around $3,340 US dollars. And that would be around maybe $81,557.23. That's not a lot of money. So he wanted her to hunt man-eating tigers that were affecting his people. Which, okay, but that's also weird. That's weird. A French noble also wrote a love letter to her and proposed taking her away from the show, and he included his photograph, and she replied by shooting the photograph through the man's head and sent it back saying, respectfully declined. So this was happening because her stage name was technically Miss Oakley. So a lot of men assumed that she was unmarried and that she needed a protector. Honey, you could know. But they didn't realize that this was all part of the show business image that her husband made of her. Like, this was on purpose. Because you get big. So she would receive a lot of similar letters throughout her whole entire career. The show made its way to the Chicago Exposition of 1893, and by the 1890s, bicycles were all the rage and were mass-produced for the very first time. So what did Annie do? Well, she learned how to ride a bike. She bought one in England, and she actually became the first woman cyclist in London. This woman is just unbelievable. I love her. So she brought it back to America, and she learned how to ride it without using her hands, of course, to shoot. She actually designed a modest, practical outfit for women, but it did not include bloomers, which she did state that was unladylike. Gotta wear the undies. Even though she was very set in her ways with femininity, she claims that she was not a feminist. Girl, I'm sorry, you're a feminist. So she actually did want to raise a regiment of armed fighting women when America went to war against Spain in 1898. And she submitted a request to the president, but her request was denied because women were not allowed to serve. But she tried. Oh my god, if she was allowed to do that, like, think about the fucking... Oh, she was so ahead of her time for that. So Frank, during this time, was basically Annie's manager. He had really good relations with journalists, and he would make sure she would get favorable press. He would make deals with gun and ammunition makers, so she would have the equipment to use. Throughout the years, even though Annie was in the show and was famous, she would still enter shooting competitions, and she would, of course, usually win. She beat the Crown Prince of Russia once when he came to visit England. She was in the Grand American Handicap in Kansas City in 1902, which became the last year that they would actually use live pigeons. I tried to research that a little bit, and they have a website, a little article. They never mentioned that Annie Oakley was even there. Sports magazines and associates would give her medals and trophies and stories, and by the turn of the century, she had a huge collection. Because of Annie, women were starting to be allowed to join sport shooting. In the early 1900s is when women were first being allowed to join sports like croquet, tennis, archery, and a lot of them were inspired by Annie. Annie believed that any woman would benefit from learning to shoot as a form of exercise and self-defense. She defended the idea that women in city streets should have revolvers hidden on their person. But she said she was never a feminist, which is funny. By 1900, Annie was 40 years old, and the couple had finally decided to leave show business for a little while. So in 1893, they actually did build a house in Nutley, New Jersey, and they would spend their time there during breaks at this house. But in 1901, they were both on a train traveling for the Wild West show, and they were sleeping when the train crashed head-on with a freight train in North Carolina. Annie's back was injured and had to have many spinal surgery. She, of course, had to leave the show. She would write her fans about the situation and that the shock of the accident actually turned her hair white. The real reason it turned white was that she was left in a scalding spa bath for too long. I can't even imagine that. Because of this, she would wear wigs from then on. She did try to settle in the house and live a normal domestic life, but she could not stand it. She sold the house in 1904, and they resumed living a wandering life in hotels, in boarding houses, and tents. Like, you've lived that way since you were 15 years old, and now she's 40, and trying to finally settle. No, that's your life. That's the life that you have lived for decades, and you can't really just give up on that. You can't leave that. So in 1904, a lot of newspapers were running a story that she was addicted to cocaine and was stealing to finance the addiction, and she ended up in prison. What the fuck? You wanna fight, bro? You wanna fight? She fought. She ended up suing over 30 newspapers. Why? There was also a woman in Chicago pretending to be Annie Oakley, and the press back then just like did not fact check anything. So I think they were just writing about this random lady who said she was Annie Oakley and was probably the one with the problems. But like the press, really? Really? Annie was super eager to defend her reputation, and she won several of these cases, which scared a lot of other newspapers to settle out of court. She ended up winning $27,500 in damages from the Chicago news baron William Hearst, which is, are you ready for this number? Okay. $983,831.69 today. Nearly $1 million worth of money today is what she won. Don't mess with her. There was this creepy man who sent a PI to Greenville, Ohio to try to dig up scandals against her. So over the next few years, most of the income came from Frank when he worked as a salesman for an ammunition company in Connecticut, and Annie's winnings from competition shooting matches. She joined the Vernon Seavers Young Buffalo Show from 1911 to 1913. She would give free tickets to the children from the orphanage where she was as a child. She developed a new trick of firing behind her back while using a mirror, of course hitting her targets with perfect ease because she's Annie Oakley. She would split playing cards held lengthways with a single shot. Throughout the teens of the 1900s, she would travel between Florida, Ohio, Maryland, and New Jersey, and she was still competing and hunting and teaching women to shoot. Now, it's World War I, and what does Annie Oakley do? Well, she writes President Wilson, offering again to raise a regiment of women sharpshooters, but he declined. He was, however, really glad to learn that at her own expense, she was giving shooting exhibitions to young army recruits in small military camps because she's just a fucking badass. I'm sorry, I'm gonna cuss. She's just teaching people, like, you guys are such bad shooters. I'm sorry, I'm gonna teach you how to do it properly. And just because she wants to help, but she's not allowed to. In 1922, she was 62 years old, and she was starting to contemplate another comeback, considering movie offers, but unfortunately, she was involved in a serious car accident near Daytona, Florida. She was in the hospital for almost a month, and she was forced to wear a leg brace, and she had trouble walking. So she ended up moving to Dayton in December of 1925 to be with her sister Emily and her family. And in 1926, she moved back to Greenville, Ohio. On November 3rd, 1926, she passed away from pernicious anemia in Greenville, Ohio with her friends and family nearby. Pernicious anemia is a relatively rare autoimmune disorder that causes diminishment in the dietary vitamin B12 absorption. Oh, that's so bad. If you lack B12, you literally start to go crazy. Her husband Frank died 3 weeks later, basically from heartbreak. One biographer said that he stopped eating and he died of malnutrition and starvation. He couldn't do it without her. Annie's remains were cremated, and even though they died 3 weeks apart from each other, they were able to be buried together, which is nice. And they were buried in their Moses family plot on Brock near Greenville, Ohio. After Annie passed away, she did have a musical come out about her in 1946 called Annie, Get Your Gun, which starred on Broadway and film. In 1953, an ABC television station created the popular Annie Oakley TV show that ran for 4 seasons until 1956. And the very last thing, which I think is very nice, Annie's mom, Susan, was able to see Annie's rise to fame throughout the years before she ended up passing away at the age of 76, which I'm glad, some of her family, got to see her rise to fame and see, how successful she is and where they started and how fucking hard they fucking struggled to survive. And she went to the moon and back. And she was fucking amazing. We learned nothing about her in school at all. And she was born and raised and died and was buried 30 miles from my hometown. And I've always seen that sign about Annie Oakley's grave and the giant, we just never knew, why was she here? It just seemed so random. And she's our little local celebrity, and I think that's so cool. But thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was such a random video. I've never done just a plain old history video just about someone's life like this, but Annie Oakley has always kind of been on my mind, just kind of like a mysterious, famous person that was just buried 30 miles from my hometown. I had no clue why. I'm kind of sad that they don't teach the local people about this, or I don't know if they do in Greenville or not. I have no clue. And yeah, I don't know if the grave is haunted or anything like that. I actually hate graveyards. I just want to be there to respect the dead and leave. I don't like to spend time there at all, but I may buy some ghost hunting equipment. I feel like that might be disrespectful. I hate graveyards. I hate everything about them. But thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it. Give me a like and subscribe if you would like to see more of me. I would greatly appreciate it, and I have a lot more videos lined up, but I think this is honestly going to be the last one of the year. So have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and whatever you celebrate, and have a Happy New Year, and be safe, okay?